Sarah Martinez looked at herself in the small mirror in the staff room. Her black vest was clean and pressed. Her white shirt was neat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She looked like every other server who would work at tonight's big party. But Sarah was different from the others in ways that nobody could see. She walked out of the staff room and into the most beautiful room she had ever seen. The ballroom at Riverside Estate was huge. Crystal lights hung from the high ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The floor was made of white and gray marble that shined like glass. Tall windows showed the gardens outside where small lights twinkled in the trees. Rich people were everywhere. Women wore long dresses that cost more money than Sarah made in a year. Men wore perfect black suits with shiny shoes. They talked and laughed while holding glasses of expensive wine. The sound of their voices mixed with soft music that played from hidden speakers. Sarah picked up a silver tray filled with small glasses of champagne. The glasses were so thin and delicate that she was afraid they might break if she breathed on them wrong. She had practiced carrying trays like this for hours before tonight. The catering company that hired her said this was one of the most important parties of the year. They told all the servers to be perfect or they would never work for rich people again. As she walked through the crowd, Sarah heard bits of conversation. The people talked about their big houses, expensive cars, and trips to places she had only seen in pictures. They spoke about business deals worth millions of dollars like other people talked about buying groceries. Some of them were nice, too. Her when she offered them drinks. They said, "Thank you," and smiled. Others acted like she was invisible. They took drinks from her tray without even looking at her face. Sarah did not mind being invisible tonight. She was happy to have this job. The money she would make tonight would help her pay rent for her small apartment. It would also help her buy food for the next 2 weeks. Most importantly, it would help her pay for her piano lessons. Very few people knew that Sarah spent every free moment she had playing piano and studying music. During her breaks, Sarah found quiet corners where she could watch the party without getting in the way. She saw famous people she had only seen on television before. There was the woman who owned 3 hotels downtown. There was the man who had started a computer company that everyone used. There was the judge who was always in the newspaper. All of them were here because Richard Blackwell had invited them. Richard Blackwell was the reason for tonight's party. He was one of the richest men in the city. He had made his money by creating apps that millions of people used on their phones. Tonight was his yearly charity party where he raised money for sick children. Sarah thought it was nice that he used his money to help others. She had read about him in magazines and newspapers. He seemed like a good person who cared about making the world better. The ballroom had many beautiful things to look at. There were huge flower arrangements with roses and lilies that smelled like heaven. There were paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in museums. There were sculptures made of gold and silver that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers. But the most beautiful thing in the room, at least to Sarah, was the piano. It sat in one corner of the ballroom like a sleeping giant. The piano was black and so shiny that Sarah could see her reflection in it from across the room. She knew it was a Steinway piano, one of the best pianos ever made. She had dreamed of playing a piano like this her whole life. Her own piano at home was old, and some of the keys stuck when she pressed them. But this piano looked perfect. Every key would make exactly the right sound. Sarah tried not to stare at the piano, but her eyes kept going back to it. She wondered what it would feel like to sit at that bench and put her fingers on those keys. She wondered what her favorite songs would sound like on such a beautiful instrument. She had been playing piano since she was 6 years old. Her grandmother had taught her the first songs on an old piano that barely worked. But even on that broken piano, Sarah had fallen in love with music. When Sarah was in high school, her music teacher said she had a special gift. The teacher helped her get a scholarship to study music at the local college. Sarah had worked hard for 4 years, practicing piano for hours every day. She learned to play songs by the greatest composers who had ever lived. She learned to make the piano sing and cry and laugh. She dreamed of becoming a professional pianist who would play in concert halls around the world. But dreams and real life were different things. After college, Sarah discovered that very few people made money playing piano. She had tried to find work as a musician, but there were not many jobs. She had played at a few small events and weddings, but the money was not enough to live on. So she had taken jobs serving food and cleaning houses and doing whatever work she could find. Every day she promised herself that she would not give up on music. Every night she went home to her small apartment and played her old piano until her neighbors complained about the noise. Tonight was just another job to help her survive while she chased her dreams. She did not expect anything special to happen. She just wanted to do her work well, earn her money, and go home. She had no idea that this night would change her life forever. As the evening went on, more guests arrived. The ballroom became more crowded and more noisy. Sarah and the other servers moved carefully through the crowd, offering food and drinks and making sure everyone was happy. The guests were having a good time. They laughed at each other's jokes and took pictures with their expensive phones. Sarah noticed that some of the guests kept looking at the piano, too. A few of them walked over to examine it more closely. She heard one woman tell her friend that it was worth more than most people's houses. A man in a gray suit said he wished someone would play it, because music would make the party even better. Sarah kept working, but she could not stop thinking about the piano. She imagined herself walking over to it and sitting down at the bench. She imagined playing one of her favorite pieces while all these important people listened. In her daydream, they were amazed by her talent and gave her a standing ovation. But she knew that was just a silly fantasy. She was here to serve drinks, not to perform music. The real world was different from her dreams. In the real world, she was just a server in a black vest and white shirt. In the real world, she was invisible to most of these people. In the real world, she would go home tonight with tired feet and enough money to pay her bills for another week. The beautiful piano would stay silent, and her dreams would have to wait for another day. Richard Blackwell stood near the bar, holding a glass of expensive whiskey and talking to his friends. He was a tall man with gray hair and cold blue eyes. His black suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. He wore a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. People said he was smart and successful, but they also said he could be mean when he wanted to be. Tonight, Richard was in a strange mood. The party was going well. His guests were happy. The food was good. The music was nice. But Richard felt bored. He wanted something interesting to happen. He wanted to be the center of attention. He liked it when people looked at him and talked about him. He liked to feel important and powerful. Richard's eyes moved around the room, looking for something, or someone to entertain him. He saw his guests talking and laughing, but they were not paying attention to him. He was the host of this party, but people were having fun without him. This made him feel annoyed. He wanted to do something that would make everyone look at him. Again. That was when he noticed Sarah. She was carefully arranging glasses on a table near his precious piano. She moved quietly and gently, trying not to disturb the guests who were standing nearby. Richard watched her for a moment. She looked young and nervous. Her hands shook a little as she worked. She was obviously not used to being around such rich and important people. Richard smiled, but it was not a kind smile. He had an idea that he thought would be very funny. He would embarrass this young server in front of all his guests. It would be entertaining to watch her get confused and scared. It would remind everyone that he was the important person here, and she was just someone who worked for him tonight. Richard walked over to where Sarah was working. His expensive shoes made clicking sounds on the marble floor. Several of his friends followed him, curious about what he was going to do. As he got closer to Sarah, other guests started to notice. Conversations began to stop. People turned to watch. "You there," Richard said in a loud voice that carried across the room. "Server," Sarah looked up, surprised. She had been concentrating on her work and had not seen him coming. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I see you're working very close to my piano," Richard said. He spoke loudly enough that many people could hear him. "I hope you're being careful. That instrument is worth more money than you will make in your entire life." Sarah's face turned red. She could feel people staring at her. "Yes, sir. I'm being very careful," she said. Richard's friends began to gather around. They could tell he was up to something, and they wanted to watch. More guests noticed the commotion and moved closer. Soon, a small crowd had formed around Sarah and Richard. "Tell me," Richard continued, his voice getting louder, "do you even know what this is?" He pointed at the piano with his glass of whiskey. "It's a piano, sir," Sarah answered. Her voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear her. "A piano," Richard laughed. "Yes, but not just any piano. This is a Steinway grand piano. It was made by hand by master craftsmen. It took them months to build. Do you know how much it cost?" Sarah shook her head. She wanted to disappear. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her. Some people looked sorry for her. Others looked amused. A few looked embarrassed by Richard's behavior, but none of them said anything to stop him. "More than you will ever see in your lifetime," Richard said. "I bought it because I appreciate fine things. Beautiful things. Things that require skill and talent to create and to use." He moved closer to Sarah. "Tell me, have you ever even touched a piano before? Or do you think it's just an expensive piece of furniture to put drinks on?" Sarah's face was now bright red. She wanted to run away, but she needed this job. She needed the money. She could not afford to make Richard angry by walking away. I have played piano before, sir," she said, in a voice that was barely a whisper. The crowd around them grew larger. More and more guests stopped their conversations to watch what was happening. Some of them looked uncomfortable, but they did not want to upset their host by telling him to stop. "You have played piano?" Richard laughed loudly. "Really? Where? At some dive bar? At a church basement? I'm sure it was nothing like this beautiful instrument." His friends laughed along with him. They thought he was being clever and funny. They did not see the hurt in Sarah's eyes or the way her hands were shaking. "I studied piano in college, sir," Sarah said. She spoke a little louder this time, trying to find some courage. "College." Richard made the word sound like a joke. "What kind of college? Some little community college where they teach you to play Happy Birthday and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" More people were watching now. The entire party seemed to have stopped to see what Richard Blackwell was doing to the young server. Sarah felt like she was on a stage with bright lights shining on her. But this was not the kind of performance she had ever dreamed of. "I studied classical music," Sarah said. Her voice was stronger now. Something inside her was starting to fight back against his cruelty. Classical music. Richard was enjoying himself now. He had everyone's attention. How wonderful. A server. Who thinks she knows about classical music? Tell me, what did you study, Mozart, Beethoven, or maybe just some simple songs that sound fancy? Sarah looked around at all the faces watching her. Some people looked sorry for her. Others looked entertained by the show Richard was putting on. A few looked angry at Richard, but they were afraid to say anything. "I studied many composers," Sarah said. "Chopin, Bach, Liszt, Rachmaninoff." How impressive. Richard's voice was full of fake amazement. "She knows the names of famous composers. I'm sure she can pronounce them correctly, too." He turned to his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a classical pianist working as a server at our party tonight. Isn't that fascinating?" Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. They could see that Richard was being cruel, but he was their host. He was rich and powerful. They did not want to make him angry at them. Richard turned back to Sarah. His eyes were bright with mean pleasure. "You know what I think would be wonderful? I think you should give us all a little demonstration of your musical talents." The crowd went very quiet. Sarah's heart began to beat very fast. "Yes," Richard continued. "Why don't you sit down at my beautiful piano and play something for us?" Show us all what a server's musical education looks like. I'm sure it will be very entertaining." He smiled his cold smile. "Come on, don't be shy. You said you studied classical music. Here's your chance to prove it. Play something impressive for us." Sarah looked at the piano, then back at Richard, then at all the people watching her. She felt trapped. If she said no, Richard would probably fire her and tell everyone she was a liar. If she said yes, she would have to play in front of all these important people while they expected her to fail. But as she looked at that beautiful piano, something changed inside her. She had spent years learning to play. She had practiced until her fingers bled. She had dreamed of moments when she could share her music with the world. This was not how she had imagined it would happen, but maybe this was her chance. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible. Maybe it was time to show Richard Blackwell and all his rich friends what a server who studied classical music could really do. The ballroom became so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Everyone was staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. Some faces showed pity, as if they felt sorry for the young server who had been put in such an embarrassing position. Other faces showed curiosity, wondering if she would actually dare to touch Richard Blackwell's expensive piano. A few faces showed cruel amusement, as if they were looking forward to watching her make a fool of herself. Richard Blackwell stood, with his arms crossed, smiling his cold smile. He was sure that he had won this little game. Either the girl would refuse to play and admit that she had been lying about knowing music, or she would sit down and play badly, proving that servers had no business pretending to be musicians. Either way, he would get the entertainment he wanted, and everyone would remember that he was the important person here. Sarah's hands were shaking as she looked at the beautiful black piano. It seemed to glow under the crystal lights. The bench in front of it looked like a throne that she had no right to sit on. She thought about all the famous pianists who had probably played instruments like this one. She thought about the concerts she had dreamed of giving someday. She had never imagined that her first performance for such an audience would happen like this. Behind her, she could hear people whispering to each other. "Poor girl," someone said quietly. "He shouldn't do this to her." Another voice said, "She should just walk away. This is cruel." But a third voice said, "I want to see what happens. This should be interesting." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her the first simple songs on an old piano that was missing 3 keys. She thought about her college professor, who had told her that she had a gift and should never give up on it. She thought about all the hours she had spent practicing, all the sacrifices she had made to pursue her dream of being a musician. When she opened her eyes, something had changed inside her. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Determination. Anger at being treated so badly, pride in all the work she had done to learn her craft, and love for the music that had been the most important thing in her life since she was a child. "All right," Sarah said, and her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. "I'll play something for you." Richard's smile got bigger. He was sure he was about to enjoy watching her fail. His friends moved closer, eager to see the show. The other guests formed a circle around the piano area, like an audience in a theater. Sarah walked slowly toward the piano. Each step felt like it took forever. The beautiful instrument got larger and larger as she approached it. She could see her reflection in the shiny black surface. She looked small and scared, but she kept walking. When she reached the piano bench, she stopped and looked at it for a long moment. The bench was covered in soft black leather. It looked like it had never been sat on before. Sarah had sat on many piano benches in her life, but never one this beautiful or this expensive. She looked back at the crowd one more time. Richard Blackwell was still smiling his mean smile. His friends were whispering to each other and pointing at her. The other guests were watching with the kind of intense attention that people usually saved for accidents or disasters. Sarah carefully removed her white serving gloves and put them in her pocket. Her hands looked small and pale without the gloves. She flexed her fingers the way she always did before playing. This was a habit she had developed in college. Her piano teacher had taught her to prepare her hands and her mind before touching the keys. She sat down on the bench and immediately felt how perfect it was. The height was exactly right. The distance from the piano was perfect. Everything about this instrument had been designed to make beautiful music. Sarah had never sat at such a professional setup before. She looked at the keys in front of her. They were pure white and black, perfectly clean and perfectly aligned. Each key looked like it was waiting to be touched. Sarah knew that this piano had been tuned recently. She could tell just by looking at it that every note would be exactly right. The ballroom was still completely silent. Sarah could feel the weight of all those eyes watching her. She could feel Richard Blackwell's expectation that she would embarrass herself. She could feel the tension in the room as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sarah took a deep breath and thought about what piece she should play. She could play something simple and safe, something that would not risk too much. She could play For Elise or The Entertainer or another song that most people would recognize. That would be the smart choice. It would prove that she could play piano without taking too big a risk. But something inside her rebelled against playing it safe. Richard Blackwell had tried to humiliate her in front of all these people. He had assumed that because she was a server, she could not possibly be a real musician. He had made fun of her education and her dreams. If she was going to do this, she was not going to hold back. Sarah decided to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces she knew. It was a piece that even professional pianists found challenging. It required perfect technique, deep musical understanding, and complete emotional commitment. It was a piece that would either prove beyond any doubt that she was a serious musician, or it would show everyone that she had tried to reach too high. She placed her fingers on the keys and felt the smooth, cool surface beneath her fingertips. The keys felt perfect. They had exactly the right weight and resistance. This piano was so different from her old instrument at home. This was what a real piano was supposed to feel like. Sarah looked up one more time at the crowd watching her. Richard Blackwell was still smiling, but something in his expression had changed. Maybe he was beginning to realize that this girl was not as simple as he had thought. Maybe he was starting to wonder if his cruel joke might not turn out the way he had planned. Some of the other guests had moved closer to get a better view. Sarah could see famous faces in the crowd, people she had only seen in magazines and on television. They were all about to hear her play. This was not the way she had dreamed of performing for such an audience, but it was the chance she had been given. Sarah closed her eyes, took another deep breath, and let her fingers find the opening notes of the piece. She had played this music hundreds of times before. She knew every note, every phrase, every emotion that Chopin had written into the music. She had practiced it until she could play it in her sleep, but playing it here, on this piano, in front of these people, would be different from anything she had ever done before. This would either be the moment when her dreams came true, or the moment when they were destroyed forever. Sarah pressed the first key, and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard filled the ballroom. The final notes of the Chopin piece faded into silence, and for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed frozen in time. Sarah's hands remained on the keys, her eyes closed, still feeling the last emotions of the music flowing through her. She had given everything she had to that performance. Every year of practice, every sacrifice she had made for her music, every dream she had carried in her heart had been poured into those 10 minutes at the piano. Then the silence broke. The Applause started with one person clapping, then another, then suddenly the entire ballroom erupted in the loudest, most enthusiastic applause Sarah had ever heard. People were not just clapping politely the way they might at a dinner party. They were applauding like they had just witnessed something incredible. Some people were shouting, "Bravo!" Others were whistling and cheering. Many had tears in their eyes. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the crowd. Everyone was standing now, giving her what music people called a standing ovation. Rich and important people who probably went to concerts all the time were applauding for her as if she were a famous performer at Carnegie Hall. She could hardly believe what was happening. The applause went on and on. People did not want to stop clapping because they did not want this magical moment to end. Sarah stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaking from the emotion and excitement. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had played for small audiences at school recitals and weddings, but nothing had prepared her for this. Through the crowd of applauding people, Sarah saw Richard Blackwell. His face was red, and he looked completely shocked. The man who had tried to embarrass her just minutes before now looked small and ashamed. He realized that his cruel joke had backfired in the worst possible way. Instead of humiliating Sarah, he had given her a chance to show everyone how incredibly talented she was. And in doing so, he had shown everyone what kind of person he really was. As the applause finally began to die down, people started rushing toward Sarah. They wanted to talk to her, to congratulate her, to find out who she was and where she had learned to play like that. The first person to reach her was an elegant older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "My dear," she said, taking Sarah's hands in hers, "that was absolutely magnificent. I have never heard anything so beautiful in my life." "Thank you," Sarah said, still barely able to believe what had just happened. More people crowded around her. A man in an expensive suit said, "Young lady, that was the most incredible piano performance I have ever witnessed. You have an extraordinary gift." A woman wearing diamonds said, "I have season tickets to the symphony, and I have never heard playing like that. You are amazing." Through the crowd, Sarah saw a woman approaching who looked different from the others. She was tall and elegant, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She moved with the confidence of someone important, and when she spoke, people stepped aside to let her through. "Excuse me," the woman said in a voice that commanded attention. "I need to speak with this young lady." She reached Sarah and extended her hand. "My name is Elena Rossi. I am the director of the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra." Sarah's heart almost stopped beating. The Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra was one of the most famous orchestras in the country. She had dreamed of playing with them someday, but she had never imagined meeting their director, especially not like this. "Ms. Rossi," Sarah said, shaking her hand with trembling fingers. "What you just played was absolutely extraordinary," Elena said. "I have been looking for talented young musicians for years, and I have rarely heard anything like what you just performed. We need to talk about your future in music." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Please call me tomorrow. I would like to discuss some opportunities that might interest you. The orchestra is always looking for talented soloists, and we also have connections with the best music schools and conservatories in the world." Sarah took the card with shaking hands. This was like something from a dream. Just an hour ago, she had been a server trying to make enough money to pay her rent. Now the director of a world-famous orchestra was offering to help her career. But the surprises were not over yet. Richard Blackwell had been standing at the edge of the crowd, watching everything that was happening. Finally, he pushed through the people surrounding Sarah until he was standing in front of her. "Miss," he said, and his voice was completely different from the cruel tone he had used before. "I owe you the deepest apology." Sarah looked at him, not sure what to say. "What I did to you tonight was completely wrong," Richard continued. "I tried to embarrass you because I thought it would be entertaining. I assumed that because you were working as a server, you could not possibly be a serious musician. I was completely wrong, and I am deeply ashamed of my behavior." He paused and looked around at all the people listening. "You have an incredible talent, and you deserve to be recognized for it. I would like to make up for my terrible behavior by offering to help your musical career in any way I can." Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. "I would like to sponsor your musical education and career development. Whatever you need, better instruments, lessons with the best teachers, opportunities to perform, I will provide it." Sarah could not believe what she was hearing. The man who had tried to humiliate her was now offering to help make her dreams come true. Over the next hour, as the party continued around them, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to help her. The music critic from the newspaper wanted to write a story about her. A man who owned several concert halls offered to let her perform in them. A woman who managed classical musicians offered to represent her. Elena Rossi stayed close to Sarah throughout all of this, making sure that she was not overwhelmed by all the attention. "This is just the beginning," she told Sarah quietly. "With talent like yours, you can go anywhere you want in the music world." As the evening wound down, Sarah realized that her life had completely changed in the space of a few hours. She was no longer a struggling server who played piano in her spare time. She was now a musician with real opportunities to make her dreams come true. A few weeks later, Sarah received an offer to perform as a guest soloist with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. The concert was sold out, and her performance received standing ovations and rave reviews. Music schools from around the world began offering her scholarships. Recording companies wanted to sign her. Concert halls wanted to book her for performances. The story of what happened at Richard Blackwell's party spread quickly through social media and the news. Videos that people had taken with their phones went viral. Sarah became an inspiration to millions of people who had dreams they thought were impossible. She quit her job serving at parties and dedicated herself full-time to music. She moved into a beautiful apartment with a grand piano that Richard Blackwell bought for her as part of his promise to support her career. She studied with the best teachers and performed in the greatest concert halls. But Sarah never forgot the lesson she learned that night. She remembered what it felt like to be underestimated and treated badly because of her job. She used her success to help other young musicians who were struggling to make their dreams come true. She started a scholarship fund for music students who could not afford lessons. She performed benefit concerts to raise money for music education programs. Richard Blackwell also learned an important lesson that night. He realized that treating people badly because they seemed less important than him was not only cruel but also stupid. He became one of Sarah's biggest supporters and used his wealth to help many other young artists achieve their dreams. The piano that had been the center of that incredible evening became famous, too. People called it Sarah's piano, and it became a symbol of how talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. Richard Blackwell eventually donated it to a music school so that other young musicians could play on the instrument that had changed Sarah's life forever. The first note that came from the piano was so pure and beautiful that it seemed to stop time itself. Sarah's finger had barely touched the key, but the sound that filled the ballroom was like nothing anyone there had ever heard before. It was not just a note. It was music coming to life. Sarah began the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor with such grace and confidence that the entire crowd forgot to breathe. The melody started softly, like a whisper, but every note was perfect. The piano responded to her touch as if it had been waiting its whole existence for this moment. The sound was rich and warm and full of emotion that seemed to reach into everyone's heart. Richard Blackwell's smile disappeared from his face. His mouth opened slightly as he realized that what he was hearing was not the amateur playing of a nervous server. This was the sound of a real musician, someone who understood music in ways that he had never imagined possible. The cruel joke he had planned was turning into something completely different. The other guests stood frozen in amazement. Conversations that had been happening all evening stopped completely. People who had been holding drinks forgot about them. Women who had been checking their phones put them away. Men who had been thinking about business deals found their minds completely focused on the music that was flowing from the piano. Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to make music. But it was more than just technical skill. There was something magical happening. The young woman who had seemed so small and frightened just moments before had transformed into an artist. At the piano, she was no longer a server in a black vest. She was a musician sharing her gift with the world. The piece began to build in intensity. Chopin had written this music to tell a story, and Sarah told that story with every note she played. The melody danced and soared and whispered secrets that only music could tell. Her left hand provided a foundation of deep, rich bass notes, while her right hand sang the beautiful melody lines that made people want to cry and laugh at the same time. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd had tears running down her cheeks. She had been to many concerts in her life, had heard famous pianists play in the greatest concert halls in the world, but she had never heard anything quite like this. There was something about this young woman's playing that was different. It was not just technically perfect, it was emotionally honest in a way that touched something deep inside everyone who heard it. A man who owned several art galleries found himself thinking that this was what beauty really meant. He had spent his life surrounded by beautiful paintings and sculptures, but this music was beauty that lived and breathed and changed from moment to moment. He realized that he was experiencing something that he would remember for the rest of his life. Sarah was lost in the music now. She had forgotten about the crowd watching her. She had forgotten about Richard Blackwell and his cruel words. She had forgotten about being embarrassed or afraid. There was only the piano and the music and the feeling of complete joy that came from doing what she loved most in the world. The piece moved into its most difficult section, where the melody became more complex and the technical demands were enormous. Sarah's fingers flew across the keys with speed and precision that amazed everyone watching. But speed was not the point. The point was the music itself, the way each note connected to the next one to create something larger than the sum of its parts. Richard Blackwell felt his face growing hot with shame. He realized that he had tried to humiliate someone who was incredibly talented. He had assumed that because she worked as a server, she could not possibly be a real musician. He had been completely wrong, and now everyone at his party could see how wrong he had been. The joke was on him now, but it was not funny. It was embarrassing and cruel and small. Some of the guests began to move closer to the piano, drawn by the incredible music like moths to a flame. They wanted to be as close as possible to this amazing performance. A few of them recognized the piece that Sarah was playing and were astounded by how beautifully she was interpreting it. Others did not know the music, but they knew they were hearing something special. A woman who was a music critic for the city's largest newspaper stood with her mouth open in amazement. She had reviewed hundreds of concerts and recitals, and she knew talent when she heard it. This young woman was not just good, she was extraordinary. The critic began to wonder who Sarah was and why she had never heard of her before. The music continued to build toward its climax. Sarah's whole body was involved in making the music now. She swayed slightly with the rhythm. Her face showed the emotions that were in the music: joy, sadness, hope, longing, triumph. She was not just playing the notes that Chopin had written. She was living them, feeling them, sharing them with everyone in the room. A businessman who had made millions of dollars felt tears in his eyes for the first time in years. He had forgotten that music could do this to a person. He had forgotten that anything could be this beautiful. He found himself thinking about his childhood, when his mother had played piano for him before bedtime. He had not thought about those moments in decades, but this music brought them back as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. The piece reached its most dramatic section, where the music became powerful and intense. Sarah's playing became bolder and stronger, but she never lost the delicate touch that made every note sing. The piano seemed to respond to her emotions, producing sounds that were sometimes gentle as a whisper and sometimes powerful as thunder. Everyone in the ballroom was completely focused on the music now. People who had come to the party to see and be seen, to make business deals and social connections, had forgotten all about those things. There was only this moment, this music, this incredible performance that was happening right in front of them. A young woman who was studying music at the same college where Sarah had gone stood with tears streaming down her face. She recognized how difficult this piece was, and she was amazed by how perfectly Sarah was playing it. She realized that she was watching someone who was much more talented than she would ever be, and instead of being jealous, she felt inspired. This was what music could be when it was played by someone who truly understood it. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Sarah played with such passion and skill that everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something they would never forget. This was not just a piano performance. It was a moment of pure art, pure beauty, pure human expression that transcended everything else. The final notes of the piece approached, and Sarah prepared to bring this incredible journey to its end. She had poured her heart and soul into this performance, and she could feel that everyone in the room had been touched by what they had heard. The quiet server who had been invisible just minutes before had become the center of attention in the most wonderful way possible.